The world knows Dracula as a vampire, a creature of the night that survives on human blood. It is a familiar image, easy to remember, and most importantly, comforting. A supernatural monster is always reassuring, because if evil does not belong to this world, then we can believe it will vanish when the light appears. The supernatural monster is the lie that helps us sleep. We like to believe that horror exists only in the dark, that evil comes with fangs, wings, and clear, predictable rules, that it is different from us. It does not wear a human face, but historical truth is rarely as merciful as the stories we tell ourselves. The man who inspired the Dracula legend was not an immortal creature hiding from the sun. He did not sleep in a coffin, did not fear the cross, and did not need darkness to act. He walked in daylight, commanded armies, issued orders, and left behind scenes so extreme that even folklore hesitated to follow. We want monsters to live in legend because then the real world remains bearable. But history whispers something far more unsettling, that sometimes the most frightening things are not imaginary at all, but real. Things that once existed, that were once praised, that were once called heroes. When violence is no longer an outburst, but a method. When terror is not an accident, but a design. When a man, through reason and conviction, decides to turn fear into an instrument of rule. We like to believe monsters live in the dark, but what if the truth is that they stood in the light, were given power, had their names written into history? What if myth is only a curtain drawn, so we do not have to look directly at something harder to endure? Then what is it that truly haunts us, the devil in the story, or the human being who made the story possible? If the truth is harder to survive than the myth, do we still want to hear it? Imagine ruling a land where princes do not die of old age. Here death does not arrive quietly in sleep, but crashes through half-closed doors in the night, or echoes as metal meets bone in cold stone corridors. 15th-century Wallachia was not a kingdom in any familiar sense. It was a fracture on the map of Europe, a strip of land stretched and torn between two massive grinding forces, where each passing day was a calculation of survival, and every decision carried the scent of betrayal. To the east and south stood the expanding Ottoman Empire, a power relentlessly pushing westward with iron discipline and imperial ambition. To the north and west was the Kingdom of Hungary, which saw itself as the shield of Christendom, yet was willing to sacrifice its borderlands to buy time. Wallachia lay trapped between these poles, too weak to defend itself, too significant to be ignored. It existed as a buffer zone, a predetermined battlefield, a place where blood was meant to spill so others might sleep a little easier. This was a land of unwinnable choices. Pay tribute to the Sultan to avoid annihilation, or refuse and wait for armies to cross the Danube. Swear loyalty to Hungary for protection, or accept that such protection lasted only as long as it remained convenient. In Wallachia, loyalty was not a virtue, but a currency that lost value quickly. Treaties were signed in ink and erased in blood. Oaths were spoken under solemn candlelight, only to dissolve in the screams of torture. The throne here was not a symbol of stable authority. It was a curse, an invitation to assassins, a signal for noble families, the boyars, to begin whispering behind curtains. Wallachian history is a sequence of interrupted reigns. Voivodes rose through cunning and fell by the blade. There was no gentle succession, only power vacuums, where bodies were still warm, and the next contender was already waiting. Imagine a court where smiles are masks, and silence is the safest language, where every banquet is a test, every toast a possible signal of conspiracy. These boyars were not romantic nobles from painted portraits. They were seasoned players in a brutal game, where betrayal was not an exception, but a survival skill. They shifted allegiances as easily as changing clothes, not for ideals, but for survival. Today, they knelt before a ruler. Tomorrow, they sold him to the enemy, if it meant keeping their land and families. The war in Wallachia had no clear boundary between the front line and the home. Forests were not scenery. They were ambush sites, gallows places haunted by the memory of vanished armies. Dirt roads bore the wheel marks of merchants, followed almost immediately by the boots of soldiers. Villages were burned as part of scorched earth tactics, not only to slow invaders, but to remind the people that their lives were always expendable pieces. Survival smelled of smoke mud and rusted metal. In a world like this, mercy was not rewarded. It was seen as a weakness, an invitation to collapse. A kind ruler was a dead ruler. A hesitant leader was a more confident one. Strength, decisiveness, and the ability to instill fear were the only currencies that mattered. Not because people loved cruelty, but because they understood a bitter truth. Only the one who inspired greater fear could keep this land from falling apart. We often imagine monsters as products of individual madness born from personal acts of violence. But Wallachia poses a more disturbing question. What happens when an entire system rewards cruelty and punishes compassion? When the environment forces a choice between becoming harder than stone or disappearing without a trace? In such a world, evil does not need to be taught. It is absorbed like cold air filling the lungs each morning. Imagine ruling a land where the law is too weak to protect you, where justice cannot afford to wait. Punishment here is not meant to reform, but to warn, not to persuade, but to extinguish. The silence of the streets after a brutal sentence is considered success. Order is not born from consent, but from paralysis. And from that paralysis, a distorted form of peace emerges, the peace of the grave. This is the setting, the furnace. Before any name is spoken, before any face becomes legend, one must understand what this land demanded of those who ruled it. It did not ask whether they were good, it asked whether they were ruthless enough to survive. And with each generation, the answer grew harsher. We like to believe monsters appear as anomalies, as deviations, but 15th century Wallachia suggests something else, that sometimes a monster is the most logical product of a world that leaves no other choice. When the throne is a hanging sentence, when betrayal is the breath of politics, and when war is the natural state, evil does not need to enter from outside. It is cultivated in the soil, grows alongside history, and waits for someone hard enough to wear it like armor. In such a land, gentleness is not a virtue, but an unbearable risk. Every structure of Wallachia is built to erode compassion and temper cruelty, as if the land itself accepts only those cold enough not to tremble when giving orders. Violence ceases to be an extreme option and becomes reflex, part of survival logic. Generation after generation, it seeps into how people rule, how they betray, how they hold power. Eventually, the line between human and what we call monster grows so thin it nearly vanishes. Not because anyone deliberately crossed it, but because in a world like Wallachia, that line may never have truly existed at all. Symbols endure because they never carry a single meaning. They live in ambiguity in their ability to absorb the fears and beliefs of those who look at them. In 15th century Wallachia, where everything was stretched between survival and annihilation, no symbol carried more shadowed layers than the dragon. It did not appear in folk tales, but on seals, on coins, and on the chest of a man struggling to keep his throne from collapsing. Vlad's father, a voivode, long accustomed to walking a tightrope between hostile powers, joined the Order of the Dragon, not out of romance or simple piety. It was a political oath, a commitment to survival. The order was founded to defend Christendom against Ottoman expansion, gathering rulers who stood on the front lines of that conflict. On paper, it represented faith crusade and righteous purpose, yet the symbol they chose was not the cross alone. It was the dragon, an ancient creature coiled around its own neck, both guardian and threat. For members of the order, the dragon symbolized evil to be subdued. To wear the image of the enemy was to remind oneself that defeating darkness sometimes required understanding it, even carrying a part of it. This was the cold logic of the age. To preserve the light, one had to be willing to step into shadow. But for the people of Wallachia, who lived by whispers and collective memory, symbols never stayed within official meanings. The dragon was not merely a conquered evil, it was the beast of apocalypse, the ancient serpent, the shape of destruction itself. When the voivode took the title Dracula the Dragon, the meaning split in two. In the eyes of Western courts, he was a crusader, a warrior of the cross, part of the last defensive line against the Ottomans. In diplomatic letters, the name carried dignity, even heroism, but on the tongues of local villagers, the word Dracul vibrated differently. It suggested something suspect, not entirely holy, a name balanced between protection and ruin, between faith and fear. To some, he was a crusader. To others, something darker. No explanation was needed. That fracture in perception was fertile ground for legend. When a man carried a symbol, both sacred and frightening, every action passed through a distorted lens. A harsh decision could be praised as courage, or whispered as evidence of a corrupted soul. And in Wallachia, where rumors traveled faster than armies, those lenses quickly hardened into stories. For Vlad, the child growing up under the dragon's shadow, this symbol was not abstract. It filled daily life, carved into stone walls, woven into ceremonies, embedded in the way others looked at his family. He learned early that a title was never just a name. It was a suspended judgment. When his father was called Dracula, the gaze of others lingered a moment too long, as if deciding whether to bow or step back. The cross and the dragon occupied the same symbolic space, and their tension was never resolved. It was simply accepted as reality. This family was expected to defend the faith, yet suspected of wielding a power not wholly born of light. For a child still forming his understanding of the world, that contradiction was not confusing. It became normal. The world, after all, was already like this. The most important things always had two faces. Legend does not begin with blood or darkness. It begins with symbols, with the way a name is whispered differently at night, with a sacred image stained by an extra layer of dread. When people are unsure whether to pray for someone or ask for protection from them, history starts slipping into the gray zone of collective fear. And that gray zone always exaggerates, distorts, and remembers what unsettles the most. In that environment, Vlad not only learned how to fight or distrust, he learned how to live with labels. He learned that honor and infamy could share the same emblem. He learned that true power did not come only from armies or treaties, but from how others told your story when you were not in the room. The dragon on the crest never moved, but the stories around it never stopped shifting, each retelling adding another layer of shadow. No one yet called Vlad a monster. No one spoke of vampires or curses, but the first pieces were already in place. A land accustomed to violence, a family bound to a double-edged symbol, a name that carried suspicion. All of it coexisted quietly like low clouds gathering before a storm. The legend had not been born, but it already had a vague shape fed by the very ambiguity the dragon represented. And within that ambiguity, the line between protector and something to fear was already beginning to fade. There are lessons that require no explanation. They are carved in by actions, by silences that last too long, by the moment a child realizes that the world runs on rules entirely different from the ones he was taught to believe in. Vlad learned that lesson not on a battlefield, but on a journey labeled diplomacy, where every gesture was polite and every danger was wrapped in ritual. The Ottomans did not come to Wallachia by force at that moment. They came with invitations, with promises, with the soft language of absolute power. For a voivode trying to balance between two crushing forces, it was a request that could not be refused. Loyalty had to be proven, and the most reliable proof was not gold or oaths, but people. Two boys, Vlad and his younger brother, were taken as part of the agreement, not officially as prisoners, but as living collateral. Imagine being taught that your life is collateral, not through cruelty or shouted threats, but through the quiet logic of circumstance. No one said it aloud, yet everyone understood. Your father's safety, his throne, and the fragile survival of an entire land were now bound to whether you continued to breathe. This was not betrayal screamed in anger. It was a silent, rational betrayal stamped with political reason. Life at the Ottoman court did not resemble a prison in the way people imagine. It was a gilded cage designed to both nurture and remind. Vast halls, intricate carpets, fountains whispering in garden courtyards. Everything spoke of an empire confident in its power. Vlad and his brother were educated, just well-granted access to knowledge and the discipline of a great state. But this luxury was not a gift. It was the outer skin of a threat that never disappeared. Every lesson carried a second meaning. Learning the language of the enemy was not only for communication, but to understand that you were being watched. Studying their laws and religion was not only enlightenment, but a reminder that you existed within a system that could crush you at any moment. Silent servants' unblinking eyes and the constant presence of authority gave weight to every movement. Here, freedom was not openly taken away. It was suspended, always conditional. For the two brothers, the same situation produced different responses. One learned to adapt, to soften in order to survive. The other hardened. Vlad was not beaten into submission. He was forced to observe, to learn to understand those who held his life. Inside that gilded cage, he absorbed a lesson deeper than any formal education. True power does not need to shout. It only needs to exist solid enough that everyone else adjusts themselves accordingly. No one in the Ottoman court needed to remind Vlad that his father lived because of his silence. That truth was as obvious as daylight. Every piece of news from Wallachia, every rumor of shifting alliances in the north or west, tightened that invisible bond. The child began to understand that kinship in this world could be placed beneath political stability. Not because of a lack of love, but because the system allowed no other choice. Primal betrayal does not always wear the face of a villain. Sometimes it wears the face of necessity. And that is what leaves the deepest scar. Vlad was not allowed to hate his father in a simple way. There was no outburst of anger to burn itself out. Only the cold acceptance that this was how the world functioned, that if a man wished to hold power, he had to be willing to pay with things that could never be reclaimed. In the gilded cage, time moved differently. Each day was a test of patience. Each night a reminder that your life depended on decisions made in rooms where you were absent. The threat did not need to be repeated. It was embedded in the structure of the relationship itself. And for a mind already shaped by war and suspicion, the message was impossible to miss. Core trauma is not born from a single act of violence, but from the prolonged weight of helplessness. From knowing you are a piece on the board with no moves of your own. Vlad learned to compress his emotions, not to appear strong, but to survive. Every lesson, every ritual, every gesture of generosity was stored as part of the system that held him. Not with chains, but with the naked truth that his life no longer fully belonged to him. There, within the cold luxury of the Ottoman court, something was permanently formed. Not explosive hatred, but a deep and dangerous understanding that absolute power allows people to turn human beings into collateral and call it order. Once that lesson takes root, it does not fade. It waits silently until the one who learned it finds himself standing on the other side of the bargain. Violence does not only kill, it experiments. It places two children inside the same cage and observes what each must become to survive. Vlad and Radu lived beneath the same stone domes of the Ottoman court, ate at the same tables, studied under the same teachers, and endured the same silent, ever-present threat. Yet from very early on, they chose two different paths, not because their circumstances differed, but because they learned how to breathe differently in the same lethal air. One chose to dissolve to live. The other chose to contract, so as not to be broken. Radu, the younger brother, understood the rules of the gilded cage with remarkable speed. He grasped that softness could be a form of armor, that a well-timed smile could be worth more than a sword. Radu learned Turkish not merely to understand commands, but to speak it smoothly to be liked. He absorbed the culture, the rituals, the music, and the rhythm of Ottoman court life as a way of making himself belong. In the eyes of his keepers, Radu was not a hostage. He was a beautiful, obedient boy, pliable and pleasing. A creature well adapted to a cage plated in gold. That adaptation brought rewards. Radu was favored, allowed closer to the center of power, permitted to see things Vlad could only observe from a distance. He learned that if this world could not be defeated, it was better to merge with it to survive at least under its protection. This was not cowardice. It was a deeply human form of survival, a way of saving oneself by sanding down one's sharp edges until they fit neatly into the mold prepared by those in control. Vlad could not do this, not because he lacked intelligence, but because something in him refused to melt. Vlad learned everything Radu did, but for a different purpose. He learned Turkish to eavesdrop, not to converse. He studied strategy, not to impress, but to memorize weaknesses. Every religious ritual, every training exercise, every lesson about power was stored by Vlad as evidence. Not evidence to accuse anyone, but evidence to prove to himself that this world functioned through control, not kindness. As Radu gradually stepped into the light of the court, Vlad withdrew further inward. He spoke less, smiled less. His gaze grew heavy, not with sadness, but with constant calculation, before allowing anything to touch him. Vlad did not seek acceptance. He sought only not to be consumed. In the gilded cage, Vlad did not learn how to belong. He learned how to endure. There is a moment small and briefly noted in the Chronicles that reveals more than it seems. It is said that when witnessing a public punishment at the Ottoman court, Radu turned away. Vlad did not. He stood still and watched until the ritual ended, not because he took pleasure in it, but because he understood that turning away did not make it disappear. Vlad learned to look directly at violence without allowing it to steal his shape. That is a dangerous skill. It is also the skill of those who survive a very long time in a brutal world. Neither of them was right or wrong at that moment. They were reacting, and not everyone breaks the same way. One fractures and dissolves. The other fractures and freezes. Radu gradually became part of the system that had imprisoned him, finding within it a new form of safety. Vlad built an invisible fortress, inside himself a place no one else was allowed to enter. This difference did not erupt immediately. It smoldered, accumulating like two rivers of magma beneath the same mountain calm on the surface, but flowing toward entirely different forms of destruction. For Radu, the Ottoman world ceased to be merely an enemy. It became an environment, a new home, even if it was built on conditions and threats. For Vlad, the Ottomans were an extended lesson, a classroom on absolute power, on fear as a tool of governance, and on how far a human being can be bent before losing himself entirely. And it is here, in this prolonged silence, that an invisible line is drawn. Vlad begins to diverge not through action, but through memory. Each day spent in the gilded cage is stored as a debt, not a debt owed to an individual, but to a system that taught him survival is never free. Everything has its price, and that price, sooner or later, must be paid. No new blood is spilled here, no stakes, no legends. Only two boys, abandoned into the hands of an enemy, were learning two different languages of survival. One language of assimilation, and one language of cold remembrance. The world does not yet call Vlad a monster, but from this moment on, he no longer looks at the world through the eyes of an ordinary man. He is learning how to exist in a place where humanity is a luxury and where survival sometimes means becoming the thing others fear. At the end of this part, there is no verdict, only a truth slowly emerging beneath the cold stone of the Ottoman court. When surrounded by violence, people do not only choose how to live, they choose the shape they will carry for the rest of their lives. And the shape Vlad is quietly forming will not resemble anyone else. Bad news does not arrive like thunder. It comes slowly, heavily, and without escape. It does not shout. It whispers. And that whisper is what kills the last remaining pieces of childhood. Vlad heard it inside the Ottoman court, among thick stone walls and high ceilings that carried echoes, not through funeral horns, not through ritual, just fragments of speech falling from someone else's mouth, accidental, indifferent, as if it were merely another political shift in a land accustomed to betrayal. His father was dead, not fallen on a battlefield, not killed as a defeated ruler. He was captured, betrayed by his own nobles, and murdered quietly, brutally, without honor. His body was left in the marshes, without a grave, without prayers, and as if that were not enough, Vlad's older brother, the rightful heir, suffered an even darker fate. Blinded, buried alive, not by a foreign enemy, but by those who once knelt before their family. There was no emotional eruption, no screaming, no collapse. Vlad did not fall. He stood still, and that stillness was what made it terrifying. Some moments end childhood forever. This was one of them, not because of death itself, but because of what that death meant. The world had stripped itself bare before him, revealing a raw truth: betrayal does not come from enemies. It comes from those closest to you. In a brief instant, everything Vlad had learned inside the gilded cage became brutally clear. Lessons about power, about false loyalty, about how quickly people change sides when the balance shifts. All of it led here. His family did not lose because they were weak. They lost because they trusted the wrong people. And the price of that trust was an unforgivable death. Radu reacted differently. He cried. He grieved. His pain had the shape of loss. Vlad's pain did not. It was a cold void forming where the most basic definitions of right and wrong once lived. When their father handed them to the Ottomans, Vlad learned that power could demand sacrifice. Now, watching his father and brother destroyed by their own people, he learned something far more dangerous. Morality protects no one. There was nowhere to place his anger, no enemy standing before him. Those who killed his father were not here. Those who gave the orders were invisible. All that remained was an unchangeable truth: this world does not reward loyalty. It rewards those who control fear. Vlad did not swear oaths. He did not cry out for revenge. He simply recorded the truth, and that act of recording was fateful. From that moment on, Vlad no longer saw power as a tool to rule. He saw it as a means to prevent betrayal, a barrier built from fear, not to protect the weak, but to lock down those capable of striking from behind. This idea did not arrive as a conscious decision. It grew naturally, like a scar forming, exactly where the body believes it must exist to survive. The Ottoman court did not change in the days after the news. Lessons continued. Rituals proceeded. That constancy made everything more inhuman. His father was dead, his brother buried alive, and the world kept moving. Vlad learned the final lesson of childhood suffering does not slow history. It only reshapes those who survive it. There were nights when Vlad did not sleep, not because of nightmares, but because of ruthless clarity. He lay there listening to the steady breathing of the palace and understood that no metaphysical justice would correct this. No invisible hand would rebalance the scales. If order existed, it had to be imposed. If betrayal was natural, then fear had to become the boundary. There would be no forgiveness here, not because Vlad lacked nobility, but because forgiveness in this world meant allowing tragedy to repeat itself. And Vlad learned that lesson far too early. The deaths of his father and brother did not just take his family. They destroyed his ability to return to being someone who believed morality possessed power on its own. From this point, there was no way back. Not because Vlad became cruel overnight, but because doors inside him closed. The world had proven it did not function through kindness, and Vlad no longer had any reason to pretend otherwise. A child raised on war was now matured through betrayal, and what formed inside him was not impulsive rage, but a coldness with structure. No legend was born here, no stakes, no myth, only a silent fracture where every other possibility was erased. Vlad had not yet become a monster, but from the moment that news reached him, the possibility of returning to an ordinary human life died alongside his father and brother. And the world, though it did not yet know, it had just created something it would one day lose all control over. After the deaths of his father and brother, Vlad was no longer an anonymous hostage. He became an asset, something that could be moved across the board. In the world of empires and courts, personal pain carried no value. Only position mattered. And Vlad's position, the last son of the Dracula line, suddenly became useful. The Ottoman court did not kill him. They did not need to. They saw what the men who murdered his family had failed to see: a legitimate name, a bloodline that could be used. Wallachia, the land forever caught between the jaws of greater powers, stood without a ruler once more, and an empty throne is never silent. It is an invitation. Vlad was summoned, not as a prince restored to honor, but as a piece drawn at the right moment. He was told of an opportunity, of restoring order, of returning home. But beneath every word lay an unspoken truth that required no explanation. This power did not belong to him. It was only borrowed. Power given can always be taken. Vlad did not need to be taught this. He had watched his father pay the price for believing he still had a choice. This time there was no confusion. When Vlad crossed the Danube on horseback, riding toward Wallachia, it was not a son's return. It was the deployment of a tool. Vlad's first throne was not built on loyalty. It was built on the presence of Ottoman forces standing behind him. The nobles who had betrayed his father bowed, but their eyes did not change. They did not see a ruler. They saw a boy propped up by their ancestral enemy, and Vlad saw it just as clearly. There were no illusions here, no hope of reconciliation, no sense of triumph. The throne was cold. It brought no feeling of completion, only a brutal truth: power without roots cannot stand. Every decree Vlad issued carried a silent question in the minds of those who heard it: who truly stands behind him? That reign was so brief, it barely left a mark. There was no time for reform, no time for vengeance, only time to observe. And Vlad observed. He saw how the same men who had murdered his family were now willing to kneel, not out of fear of him, but out of fear of those backing him. He saw the fragility of patronage-based power. He saw that a throne protects no one. When the balance shifted, everything collapsed as quickly as it had been assembled. Ottoman forces withdrew to focus on other campaigns, and with them vanished all support for Vlad. No new betrayal was required. Silence was enough. The throne stood exposed. Heads that once bowed began to turn away. Vlad understood that he had not been defeated. He had been abandoned. He left Wallachia, not in fire, but in the cold clarity of reality. There were no cries for a deposed king, no legacy, only a lesson deeper than any before it. Power is not a title. It does not come from ritual. It comes from the ability to make betrayal unbearable. This time, Vlad was no longer the child being taken away. He withdrew as a survivor, and within that failure, there was no despair, only adjustment. He had tested borrowed power. He had seen its end. Nothing in that experience made him wish to repeat it. Instead, it erased a path forever. From this point on, Vlad no longer sought the throne by permission. He began to understand that if power could not be taken away, then it had to be built from something that made taking it unbearable. He did not yet know the exact shape of that force, but he knew one thing with certainty: the next time he sat on the throne, no one would be standing behind him. That short reign was not a failure. It was a lesson paid for with the complete stripping away of illusion. Vlad emerged from it not with renewed hatred, but with cold clarity. He had seen what happens when power does not belong to the one who holds it. And he vowed, not in words, but in the direction of his life, that he would never repeat that mistake. The transformation was not yet complete, but the foundation had been laid. The child who once learned that his life was collateral now learned something else. The throne is the same, and to survive in this world, one cannot rely on what is granted. There is only one kind of power worth trusting, the kind that does not need reminders of who is in control. After leaving his first throne, Vlad did not vanish like a defeated man. There was no retinue dissolving into chaos, no wailing of loyal followers. He simply withdrew from history's gaze, slipping out of the center of power like a shadow that leaves no footprints. Wallachia closed behind him, not with hatred, but with the cold indifference of a land accustomed to changing rulers as easily as seasons. The next 8 years belonged to no kingdom. They belonged to damp stone corridors of foreign courts, to fortresses perched along contested borders, to rooms where conversations were spoken in half sentences and daggers were kept up sleeves. Vlad lived as a man without a fixed place, without a stable identity. At times, a guest, at times, an honored hostage, at times, merely someone allowed to exist because it was not yet time to remove him. It was in this invisible interval that he learned what no throne could teach. Not how to rule, but how to wait. This was where patience replaces rage. The anger that once smoldered inside him did not disappear, but it was forced to settle ground down into something sharper. No longer reflex, but strategy. Vlad observed courts the way one studies predators. He watched how lords traded loyalty like currency, how oaths were offered. With the same ease, they were broken. He saw that betrayal was not an event. It was a mechanism. No one treated it as shameful. It was simply a rational move on a board crowded with competing interests. War during those 8 years did not reach Vlad through grand battles. It came through late-night conversations where commanders dissected other men's failures with clinical calm. It came through maps spread across wooden tables where thousands of lives were reduced to arrows and numbers. He learned that victory does not belong to the bravest, but to the one who can endure the longest. The one who can accept cruelty as a necessary condition, not an unfortunate tragedy. During those wandering years, Vlad did not build alliances in the usual way. He did not seek friends. He sought understanding. Who feared what? Who would betray when the price was high enough? Who would remain loyal only when placed where no other option existed? He memorized small details, the evasive glance when power was mentioned, the pause before a difficult decision, the shift in tone when someone spoke of a stronger empire. Piece by piece, the pattern assembled itself, not through a single revelation, but through the brutal repetition of the same lesson wearing different faces. Order cannot be maintained by promises. It cannot rely on gratitude. Both are too fragile, too human. Order, if it is to survive in a world like Wallachia, requires a different foundation, something that demands no belief. Only fear is strong enough to paralyze betrayal before it can even take shape. Vlad never spoke this aloud. He never wrote it into doctrine, but it lived in the way he listened, in the increasingly unsettling patience he displayed. Those who encountered Vlad during this period often described a quiet man sparing with words, but possessed of a gaze that slowed conversation itself, not because it threatened, but because it carried the sense of being measured, weighed as part of an equation not yet revealed. Those 8 years were also the time Vlad learned how to exist without being liked, without being admired, without being remembered. He learned how to become invisible when necessary, and noticeable only when it served him. This ran counter to the heroic narratives history prefers to tell. Yet it was precisely this invisibility that allowed him to survive long enough to learn every lesson required. Meanwhile, Wallachia continued its familiar cycle. New rulers arrived and departed. Promises were made and swallowed by reality. News from home reached Vlad in fragments, but each fragment reinforced the same truth: nothing had changed. That land was still not meant for those who believed in mercy. It waited only for a hand strong enough to close around it. By the end of 8 years, Vlad was no longer the man driven from a throne, nor was he a pawn pushed between empires. He had become a will tempered by time, unhurried, unsparing, and most importantly, no longer believing that power could be held without exacting fear from others. The monster had not yet appeared, but everything required to create it was ready, not through madness, but through cold patience, not through blind hatred, but through an increasingly clear vision of how this world truly operates. Vlad had not yet returned, but when he did, it would not be the return of a man asking for his throne back. It would be the arrival of a new order built not on oaths, but on carefully designed fear. And in the shadow of those 8 years, the monster had been incubated long enough to no longer need haste. When Vlad returned to Wallachia, there was no triumphal song, no promise of salvation, No story of an exiled prince carrying the light of justice back with him. This return unfolded the way a hunter steps into a familiar forest, after years away, quietly focused, and without illusions about what he is about to do. Vlad did not come back to fix the world. He came back because he understood it could not be fixed. The years spent as a shadow had stripped him of the most dangerous thing youth possesses, the belief that people can be guided by ideals. What remained was a cold clarity. Wallachia did not need to be loved. It needed to be controlled. His second ascent to the throne did not arrive through the permission of a single empire. It emerged from a vacuum of power, a brief lie in the familiar chain of betrayals. Vlad stepped into that gap with the precision of someone who had waited long enough. No haste, no declarations, just a sequence of calculated moves, all aimed at a single outcome. Those who once smirked at his name now fell silent, not out of reverence, but because they sensed the difference. The man who returned was not the one who had left. There was no urgency to prove himself, no hunger for recognition. That gaze did not seek consensus. It identified obstacles. He doesn't want loyalty. He wants obedience. Vlad did not need oaths. He had seen how easily they were broken. What he required was absolute compliance, sustained not by belief, but by the understanding that the cost of defiance was non-negotiable. In Vlad's world, the choice was no longer between loyalty and betrayal. It was between obedience and disappearance. The court felt the change almost immediately. Meetings grew shorter. Orders became clearer. There was no room for extended debate or half measures. Vlad did not explain. He did not need to be understood. He needed to be followed. And when someone tested that boundary, the response came swiftly and decisively. This was not rage, not random violence. It was structured brutality. Each punishment was a coldly staged message designed to spread without words. Vlad understood that the most effective fear is the kind that does not need constant repetition. A few examples placed correctly were enough. People within Vlad's vision began to lose their individual depth. They were no longer personal stories, but components of a system. Who occupied which position, who had the potential to destabilize, who needed to be removed early to prevent larger consequences. This was not impulsive cruelty. It was a transformation. When power is viewed as a mechanism, human beings become tools for operating it. Wallachia responded like a creature held in a tightening grip. The surface grew more orderly. Crime declined. Betrayal fell silent. But beneath that surface was the rigid tension of a society learning how to hold its breath. People began to censor themselves, not because they believed in right and wrong, but because they feared making a mistake. Order emerged, but it was the order of silence. Vlad watched all of this with unsettling calm. He did not celebrate. He did not indulge in fantasies of being a savior. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he accepted the moral cost without trying to justify it. This world had taught him that every system demands sacrifice. The only question was whose. Those who had hoped for a just ruler slowly realized they had misjudged him. Vlad did not come to arbitrate good and evil. He came to eliminate instability, and if good or evil stood in the way, they were treated the same. This was the point of no return, where ideals lost all practical value. This transformation did not happen in a single moment. It was the natural result of every lesson that came before. A child raised on war. A hostage living in a gilded cage. A man who learned that borrowed power leads only to collapse. A ghost who spent 8 years learning how the world truly works. All of it converged here in the way Vlad ruled without needing to speak much at all. This time the throne was no longer cold, not because it had grown warmer, but because Vlad expected nothing from it beyond its single function, to serve as a base for power. Everything else was secondary. Reputation, affection, the praise of history. None of it mattered. Wallachia entered a new era marked not by proclamation, but by a shift in everyday behavior. People walked more carefully, spoke less, looked ahead before acting, not because they loved their ruler, but because they understood he was not someone to test. The human figure in this story began to fade. What became clearer was a method, an approach to power sharpened by trauma, betrayal, and prolonged waiting. Vlad was no longer the center of a personal tragedy. He became an operating force, a tool he himself controlled. And when a human being becomes a tool, the final boundary begins to dissolve. Not the boundary between good and evil, but the boundary between man and the thing history will later struggle to explain with other words. The monster does not appear at this moment, but from here on, it no longer needs to be created. It has begun to function. Winter withdrew from Wallachia, slowly leaving behind muddy roads and cities exhausted by surviving yet another year. As Easter approached, the atmosphere at court shifted, not with hope, but with the cautious relief of people accustomed to staying alive by anticipating the intentions of others. Vlad sent out invitations. The cards were written in formal language, carrying no threats and no references to the past. A banquet, a gesture of reconciliation, a signal that the new reign was secure enough to no longer require purges. The nobles read the words and looked at one another. Silence lingered, then broke under a convenient conclusion. If Vlad had wanted revenge, he would have taken it long ago. They came not because they trusted him completely, but because they wanted to believe. They wore their finest remaining garments after years of turmoil. Wives and children accompanied them. Jewelry was taken out of hiding. An Easter feast, by tradition, was a moment of forgiveness and renewal. In the world of the nobility, it was also a test to see whether the storm had truly passed. The great hall was prepared with care. Long tables, bright candles, roasted meat and bread lay out in orderly rows. Wine flows steadily. Vlad appeared neither late nor early. He greeted each guest with a calm that bordered on indifference. No vengeful glances, no warning signs, just a host performing his role. Music rose. Laughter spread cautious, at first then more relaxed. Stories were told carefully, avoiding dangerous subjects. People ate, drank, and began to believe they'd read the situation correctly. That this reign, however harsh, had chosen stability over revenge. That the past could be buried, as long as everyone agreed to pretend to forget. Vlad sat in his place, not engaging in long conversations. He observed, not individual faces, but the whole composition, how people moved through the space, who sat close to whom, who laughed louder than necessary, who drank more quickly under pressure. This was not a feast meant to be enjoyed. It was a final inventory. When the banquet reached its loudest point, Vlad stood. He did not strike a glass. He gave no signal. The silence did not come at once. It spread like oil, slow but unstoppable. The music stopped first, then voices, then the last small movements. All eyes turned toward the head of the table. The doors of the great hall closed. The sound was not loud, but in that moment, it carried more weight than any proclamation. There were no screams, no immediate panic, just a hollow space in the air where everyone realized at the same time that the banquet had ended before they understood what they were attending. Guards appeared along the walls, unhurried, not rough, just enough to remove any remaining doubt. Vlad began to speak, his voice steady, never louder than necessary. He did not mention forgiveness. He did not speak of Easter. He spoke of order. For years, Wallachia had been torn apart by internal betrayal, of rulers who came and went, not because of enemies beyond the borders, but because of hands working in the shadows. No one interrupted. No one dared. He did not need to list crimes. The people in the room knew their roles in that history, who had changed sides, who had stayed silent at the right moment, who had signed agreements that turned the throne into a death sentence. Vlad did not call them monsters. He did not need to. He simply placed them where they belonged in the chain of cause and consequence. When the order was given, it did not shock. It merely confirmed what the closing doors had already announced. The older men were taken first. There was no need to describe what followed to understand the message. Wallachia was accustomed to public punishments, but never had they been so systematic. Not rage, not personal revenge. This was a restructuring of power through carefully selected violence. The younger ones were not spared, but neither were they ended quickly. They were separated not to die, but to disappear from their former lives. Forced labor, construction, service to a new order in which they would have no voice. Their survival was not mercy, it was a prolonged reminder. The banquet ended without a conclusion. The hall emptied slowly. Candles burned down to their wicks. The smell of wine mixed with the scent of metal in the air. Wallachia woke the next morning to a different kind of silence. Not the tense silence of the early days of the reign, but the silence of a society that had just witnessed a new boundary being drawn. From that moment on, there was no confusion. No one spoke of forgiveness again. No one tested limits. Vlad's order was not built on promises or new laws. It was built on collective memory, on a banquet everyone remembered clearly, and on the fact that no one had left it in the way they expected. This was the first Gothic climax. Not because of the number of deaths, but from here on, Wallachia understood that the past was no longer negotiable, and the man on the throne was no longer seeking human agreement. He had chosen another language, one that no one in that hall, and no one who heard the story later, could pretend not to understand. After the Easter banquet, Wallachia did not erupt into chaos, as many had predicted. It settled. An unnatural quiet spread across cities and countryside, alike not because of peace, but because everyone understood that a new language had just been established. It did not need to be repeated in words. It did not need explanation. It had been seen. The wooden stakes did not appear all at once, nor in haste. They rose in clusters, placed with intention, near main roads, outside city gates, where merchants passed, where foreign envoys were forced to look. Not everyone punished was the same. Some were nobles, some deserters, some corrupt officials, but the way they were positioned in public space followed a single logic. This is not rage, this is design. There were no signs of impulsiveness, no chain of executions born of fury. Each punishment followed a pause, long enough for rumors to travel ahead of the evidence. Vlad understood that fear works best not through scale, but through predictability. When people do not know exactly what will happen, but know with certainty that it will happen if a boundary is crossed, they regulate themselves. The forest of stakes was not a place for venting anger. It was a visual message, a new moral map drawn with images rather than laws. No one needed to read decrees to understand what was acceptable. They only had to look. The order was carved into collective memory through shapes that could not be ignored. Vlad did not appear at the sites of punishment. He did not stand and watch. He did not speak. His absence mattered as much as the presence of the stakes. It sent a clear signal this was not the personal act of a man who enjoyed suffering. This was the inevitable outcome of violating order. The king did not need to be present. The system was already capable of operating on its own. The remaining nobles understood this quickly. They no longer sought access to Vlad for favors. They sought to avoid attention. They changed how they dressed, reduced displays of wealth, severed ambiguous alliances. Their power did not vanish entirely, but it was narrowed, reshaped, so that it could no longer pose a threat. Wallachia did not become a just paradise. It became a space with clearly defined limits where every movement was calculated. The most terrifying aspect of the Forest of Stakes was not the punishment itself, but its consistency. There were no public exceptions, no hidden deals quietly honored. When someone was punished, the question was not why, but does this fit the rule? And more often than not, the answer was yes. Vlad did not need to justify himself. His order did not seek moral approval. It required only compliance. Gradually, people stopped speaking of Vlad as a human being. In the whispers of markets and taverns, he became a concept, an invisible force, an environmental condition. People no longer said, "What will the king do?" but "This can happen." Language shifted. And when language shifts, thought follows. Foreign envoys carried stories of Wallachia beyond its borders, not always accurately, but accurately enough to form a single image, a land ordered to the point of inhumanity, a place where betrayal was not tolerated and chaos had no room to grow. Some courts were repulsed, others quietly impressed. All became more cautious when dealing with Vlad. For ordinary people, the forest of stakes produced a paradox. Daily life became safer in a narrow sense. Theft declined. Officials grew less brazen. Roads became more orderly. But the price was an atmosphere of tension where every mistake carried greater weight than before. There was no room for carelessness, no room for blind trust. Vlad watched this society function with minimal intervention. He did not need to drive it forward with speeches. The system reinforced itself. People adjusted their behavior not because they loved the king, but because they understood the consequences of disobedience. This was the moment Vlad ceased to exist as an individual. He became a principle. Within this structure, Vlad's personal emotions no longer mattered. Whether he still carried resentment or not did not change how the system operated. This confused many contemporaries, and later historians as well. They searched for madness in him for some perverse pleasure. What they found instead was more unsettling, methodical coldness. The forest of stakes was not built to satisfy the ego. It was built to eliminate ambiguity. In Vlad's world, ambiguity was the enemy. It created space for betrayal to take root. By making consequences impossible to misunderstand, he compressed that space to its minimum. In the process, Vlad erased himself from the center of the story. He was no longer the victim of betrayal, no longer the avenger of his family, no longer the exiled prince. He became the designer of an order in which people were defined by their function within stability. When that function ended, so did their presence. This was the moment history began to struggle to name him. It was no longer enough to call him a tyrant, not enough to call him a cruel ruler. Vlad had crossed beyond the personal. He had become the expression of an idea that fear, when organized and applied systematically, could become a language of power more effective than any law. The monster, if the word must be used, was no longer a creature driven by emotion. It was a structure, and once that structure was built, it no longer required its creator to appear often. It stood on its own. It spread. It sustained itself. The forest of stakes did not merely mark Vlad's territory. It marked the complete disappearance of the human from the center of this story. From this point on, what made Wallachia tremble was not a king of flesh and bone, but an order designed to function without mercy. After the forest of stakes rose, Wallachia entered a period many contemporaries called stability. Not the loud stability of victory celebrations, but a heavy stillness, as if the entire land were holding its breath at once. Roads grew safer. Markets opened on time. People left belongings at their doors without fear. Minor disputes no longer escalated into public violence. The surface of society was smoothed. Fear works. That's the problem. Theft nearly vanished, not because people suddenly became more moral, but because the cost of a small act had become impossible to predict. No one knew exactly where the boundary lay, but everyone knew that crossing it meant there would be no chance for correction. When the only options are safety or destruction, most people choose silence and compliance. Local officials changed how they worked. Small acts of corruption were cut away, not out of fear of investigation, but out of fear of being noticed. In Vlad's system, attention itself was a form of danger. The more invisible one remained, the safer one was. Ambition did not disappear, but it was compressed, forced to seek quieter paths or wait for opportunities that would never arrive. Ordinary people began speaking of the ruler in short phrases. No praise, no public complaint, just neutral descriptions. The roads are safer, the laws are clearer, there is no more chaos. Language lost its emotion, and when language grows poor, inner life contracts with it. Wallachia looked cleaner, but it was the cleanliness of a space where everything unnecessary had been removed. Troublemakers vanished. Those who spoke too much fell silent. Those who did not fit the new rhythm were pushed to the margins, not by decree, but but by the feeling that they no longer belonged. Society ran more smoothly, but laughter became rarer. Vlad appeared rarely during this period. He did not need to. The system had reached a self-sustaining state. Each person became their own supervisor. Every decision was weighed not through morality, but through survival. This produced a peculiar kind of order, efficient, consistent, and hollow. Resistance nearly ceased to exist. Not because there was no resentment, but because resentment found no safe form of expression. There was no space to test limits, no gray area to hide within. In such a society, resistance does not erupt into movements. It dissolves into thoughts never spoken and eventually no longer thought. Foreign merchants passed through Wallachia with caution. They noted the safety of the roads, the punctuality of taxes, and the strange quiet of the population. Some took this as proof of strong governance. Others felt uneasy but could not name why. Everything worked, and that very fact made the unease harder to define. In the rare surviving records, Wallachia began to be described as a land of absolute order. Few spoke of the psychological cost of that order. When fear becomes the shared foundation, it does more than eliminate crime. It also eliminates trust. People do not trust one another because they do not need to. They only need to obey the same fear. Families taught children not what was right or wrong, but what should be avoided. Ways of living were passed down, not through values, but through lists of forbidden actions. Imagination narrowed. The difference became a risk. Safety was defined as the ability to blend into the crowd. Vlad, when mentioned at all, was no longer mentioned as a person. He was in a condition, like the weather, like winter. People do not hate winter, they learn how to survive it. And in that normalization, the most dangerous thing began to appear. Fear was no longer felt as fear. It became the default state. This peace did not require soldiers flooding the streets. It needed no banners or oaths. It existed in pauses, before speaking, in averted gazes, in safe choices, repeated until they were no longer questioned. This was the peace of the graveyard, where everything sits in its proper place, and nothing moves enough to make noise. It is here that the story becomes unsettling, because if one looks only at surface results, it is hard to deny the effectiveness of this system. The order was established. Chaos eliminated. Society functioned, not in theory, but in daily life. Fear achieved what laws, persuasion, and morality had failed to accomplish for decades. But the cost of this efficiency was never written into the records. It lived in the gradual contraction of inner life, in people stopping themselves from asking questions, not because answers existed, but because questions became dangerous. In choosing survival over living in alignment with oneself, Vlad did not celebrate this peace. There is no sign he considered it a personal victory. He saw it as a necessary equilibrium, a phase society had to pass through to avoid destroying itself. But history rarely distinguishes between means and ends. It records only outcomes, and the outcome here was a land quiet to an alarming degree. A place where order was maintained, not through consent, but through the absence of any other option. The listener looking at this picture begins to feel uneasy, not because of what is happening, but because of how smoothly it is happening. Fear works, and because it works so well, the question is no longer whether this method is effective. The question is whether, after living in such a system long enough, people still remember what it feels like to exist without fear. The peace of the graveyard does not smell immediately. It is silent. It is tidy. It can be praised from a distance. But within it, life does not grow. It is merely permitted to continue as long as it does not disturb anything fixed in place by fear. And at this point, the story no longer allows the listener to stand safely outside as an observer. Because if an order built on fear can be this effective, then the problem no longer lies with Vlad. It lies in how much people are willing to trade away to live in a world that feels stable. The silence of Wallachia did not last forever. It was like a lake temporarily frozen with currents beneath that never stopped moving. When Vlad ceased paying tribute, when envoys no longer returned south, when border roads grew unnaturally quiet, the outside world began to realize that the peace of the graveyard was only a preparatory phase. What was coming was not war in the familiar sense. It was a rejection of the very concept of compromise. Opposing Vlad was not an equal kingdom. It was an empire with armies accustomed to decisive battles, accustomed to seeing enemies lined up on open fields, accustomed to crushing resistance through numbers and materiel. Vlad understood this clearly. He did not seek victory through strength. He sought to make victory meaningless for the invader. The war began not with trumpets, but with disappearance. Villages stood empty. Granaries burned. Wells were fouled with animal carcasses. The roads the Ottoman army advanced along became corridors of death where everything that once sustained human life had been drained away. This was not the strategy of a ruler seeking glory. It was the thinking of someone who had accepted that his land would be destroyed if that destruction made occupation impossible. Guerrilla warfare became the primary language of the conflict. Small cavalry units emerged from forests, struck quickly, and vanished before the enemy could understand what had happened. There were no grand battles to record in chronicles, only scattered reports of patrols that never returned, soldiers killed in their sleep, and roads thought safe turning into traps. Exhaustion spread faster than any spear. Vlad did not attack only the bodies of the enemy army. He attacked their biological rhythm, sleepless nights, days without water, growing suspicion among comrades. When there is no clear boundary between the front line and rear, every moment can be lethal. And in that state discipline, the empire's greatest pride began to fracture. Then the disease appeared, not as a random misfortune, but as part of a strategy. Those infected were pushed toward enemy camps. Fever moved through crowded tents. Death no longer took the shape of an enemy that could be cut down. It became invisible, unnegotiable, and impossible to avenge. An army accustomed to violence now faced helplessness. Imagine seeing this after weeks of silence. As Ottoman forces advanced deeper, they began to sense that this land did not resist in conventional ways. It did not seek to repel them immediately. It eroded them step by step, as if Wallachia itself refused to allow them to exist upon it. And just when they believed they had adapted to this brutality, just when they thought the worst was behind them, Vlad prepared a blow aimed not at tactics, but at memory. The forest of the impaled was not created in frenzy. It was designed. The stakes stood in ordered lines. Heights are carefully graded. The locations chosen are unavoidable. This was not a hidden execution site. This was a landscape. A visual declaration was placed precisely where the enemy would be forced to see it before thinking of advancing. When the Ottoman vanguard emerged from the woods and saw it, the first response was not screaming. It was stillness. A primal pause as the mind tried to process what stood before it. Thousands of bodies motionless, arranged like an army of the dead. No chaos, no haste, only the cold order of death extended endlessly. The smell of decay arrived before the image, a warning that required no translation. Blackbirds covered the stakes as if this were a natural part of the ecosystem. And at the center of it all, there was no Vlad, no explanation, no written message, only the overwhelming presence of a will that had decided fear was the only remaining form of communication. For soldiers who had survived countless campaigns, this was not the most brutal sight they had ever seen, but it was the most deliberate. It did not follow a battle. It bore no mark of chaos. It resembled an exhibition constructed to convey a single idea that this war recognized no familiar moral limits, and that the man opposing them was willing to turn the world into hell if that was what it took to make them leave. Psychological warfare reached its peak here. No further great battle was required. No additional losses were needed to demonstrate strength. The image completed its task on its own way. Questions began circulating among Ottoman commanders, not about how to defeat Vlad, but about the cost of continuing. How do you conquer a land whose ruler is willing to destroy everything, including himself, to avoid conquest. Vlad did not stand in the forest of stakes to witness the reaction. He did not need to. He understood the mechanics of fear. He had lived inside it long enough to know that once an image powerful enough is planted in the mind, it will replicate on its own. Every soldier who withdrew carried the story with him. Each retelling grew slightly larger than reality. And in war, imagination is always the most dangerous ally. This war had no clear moment of victory. No treaty signing was celebrated. Only a withdrawal, quiet but decisive. The empire was not defeated militarily. It was convinced that the cost of victory outweighed its value. And that is what makes this moment so haunting in history, a vast army turning back, not because it lacked strength, but because it had seen something it could not endure. This was Vlad's apex, not as a warrior, but as an architect of fear. At this point, he no longer acted as a wounded individual. He functioned as a system, a cold logic in which human beings were merely components of a larger message. The Forest of the Impaled was not an outburst. It was the final declaration of a war without compromise. And because of that, the image did not vanish with the corpses. It persisted in collective memory, in whispered accounts, in chronicles written in dread. It marked the moment Vlad crossed the final boundary between man and symbol. From here on, he was no longer merely a king or a tyrant. He became an image, something history cannot easily classify, and the human imagination cannot stop enlarging. No triumph awaited Vlad Dracula. After the nightmare called, the Forest of Stakes forced the Ottoman army to turn back. There were no victory songs, no gates thrown open to welcome a returning hero. What waited for him on the other side of the war was not glory, but the cold silence of those who had once called him their final shield. Wallachia still stood, but the price paid had exceeded what distant, secure courts were willing to endure. When the immediate threat receded, the existence of a man like Vlad became inconvenient. Hungary did not see a savior. They saw a variable, someone who could not be controlled by promises, who did not bend to polite morality, and most dangerously, a man who had proven that fear could outweigh armies. In the world of kings, such a thing could not be allowed to exist for long. Meetings took place in cold stone halls, where war existed only as maps and seals. There, no one spoke of burned villages or bodies on stakes. They spoke of stability. And Vlad Dracula had become the embodiment of prolonged instability. When the invitation arrived, it wore the costume of diplomacy, a meeting, a promise of aid, a shared future against the Eastern enemy. Vlad knew this language well. He had grown up in rooms where every sentence carried two meanings. Even so, he could not know this would be the last time he entered that world of elegant words without chains. When the door closed behind him, there was no drawn sword, no struggle, only a decision already signed. History sometimes does not need blood to kill a man. Ink is enough. The Hungarian prison was not a damp dungeon like those later stories would imagine. There were no rusted chains, no nightly torture. It was a refined captivity, polite and precise, worthy of those who understood power. Vlad was given rooms, food, and life, but he no longer existed within the current of the world. The man who had made empires hesitate was placed outside the board, like a piece that had served its purpose. There was no need to kill him, only to remove him. In that void, something else began to move. Not armies, not kings, but stories. Printing presses, that new technology, still smelling of ink and metal, began to do what blades could not reshape memory. The Saxons, the merchants whose power Vlad had crushed, did not forget. They could not defeat him on the battlefield, but now he was no longer there to resist. And paper does not feel pain. Pamphlets appeared. Cheap, easily copied, easily spread. They did not tell stories of context. They did not speak of borders or impossible choices. They spoke only of stakes, of blood, of feasts among corpses. Woodcut images, crude yet direct, nailed themselves into the viewer's mind. A man dining calmly, surrounded by a forest of bodies pierced through the flesh. No explanation needed, No context required, only repetition. Stories travel faster than the truth. Truth requires time to be understood. Stories only need to be believed. And belief, when fed by fear, spreads faster than any army. Vlad was no longer a border prince. He became a symbol, not of order or resistance, but of pathological pleasure. What had once been a political tool was stripped of purpose, exaggerated, twisted, and reborn as grotesque entertainment for cities that had never smelled war. In his prison, Vlad never saw those pages, but he felt his own disappearance. No one questioned him. No one asked for explanations. This silence was different from those before. It was not the calm before a storm. It was the emptiness after everything had already been decided. What was imprisoned was not only his body, but the final version of the human being himself. Outside the name Dracula began living a separate life, detached from memory, motive, and context. When a person loses the right to tell his own story, others will do it for him, and they will always tell it in ways that serve themselves. Hungary needed a justification for abandoning the crusade. Merchants needed a monster to explain their failures. Europe needed a simple fear easy to consume. Vlad Dracula satisfied all of them. He was crushed not by the enemies he had faced, but by the allies who once stood behind him. Years passed in silence. Beyond the invisible bars, the image of him drifted further from its original truth. Blood became the center. Not the blood of war, but blood as personal obsession. Stories accumulated details unchecked because they were never meant to explain, only to horrify. When history grows tired of complexity, it kills the man to preserve the myth. By the time Vlad was released, the world no longer had a place for him as it once had. What stepped out of confinement was not only an older man, but a shadow already defined long ago. Whatever he did afterward, whatever he could still do, lay beneath ink that had already dried. The final betrayal was not the closing of the door years earlier. It lay here. While Vlad lived, he was stripped of the right to exist as a human being. And when he died, he finally began to live as a monster in the imagination of the world. Myth does not need truth. It only needs a space large enough to plant fear. And that space had been created carefully, deliberately, by the very people who once trembled at the sound of his name. Vlad Dracula was still alive when the final transformation began. Not a transformation of the body, but of the image. While he existed quietly behind bars, the outside world discovered a way to use him more effectively than any military campaign ever could. No armies, no borders, just paper, ink, and fear framed the right way. Pamphlets appeared in German cities as a new form of entertainment. They were thin, cheap, easy to buy, and easy to pass around. The content did not need to be accurate. It only needed to shock. And no figure was better suited than Vlad, an Eastern prince, a strange-sounding name, a distant and vaguely imagined land, and most importantly, stories brutal enough to exceed the familiar moral limits of a safe Europe. Truth was no longer the main ingredient. It was too complex, too slow. People wanted something easier to swallow. Woodcuts emerged as a visual weapon, rough black and white carvings, but direct and merciless. Vlad was no longer depicted as a human being. He was placed at the center of rows of stakes, surrounded by twisted bodies, faces frozen in permanent agony. Some images showed him eating among corpses, blood flowing like streams, the space around him resembling an opened hell. One asked when this scene happened, where it took place, or why. It did not need answers. It only needed to be seen. Blood in this world became a symbol. It was no longer a consequence of war or punishment, but a preference. Blood was repeated, emphasized, exaggerated, until it no longer represented death, but essence. Vlad was no longer a man who used violence as a tool. He became a man who loved violence for its own sake. This was the most important shift. When the motive disappears, the monster begins to live its own life. The man disappears. The monster sells. Printers understood this perfectly. A human being with a complex political context, does not sell well. A one-dimensional monster does. And so with every reprint, the real man was worn down a little more. New details were added unchecked. Bloody feasts, acts beyond any logic of power. Not because they were true, but because they fit. At some level, Dracula was invented, not from Vlad, but from the needs of the reader. Post-medieval Europe was changing. Cities were denser, war was farther away, and violence became something heard about rather than seen daily. People needed an outlet for their vague anxieties. They needed a concrete shape to absorb unnamed fears. Dracula, in cheap printed sheets, fulfilled that need perfectly. No one cared anymore that these images came from Vlad's economic enemies. One mentioned that the Saxons had reasons to embellish. When a story is repeated often enough, its origin stops mattering. It becomes a functional truth, a truth that serves emotion, not history. And emotion, especially fear, always wins. In this process, Vlad lost all capacity to resist. He did not write memoirs. He had no network to tell his version. He was silenced at the exact moment the world learned to speak for him. What remained was the name Dracula, a name strange enough to intrigue, dark enough to suggest meaning. It was repeated again and again, each time farther from its original truth. Eventually, the name no longer needed the man behind it. What is terrifying is not that these stories were fabricated. What is terrifying is that they worked. They entered collective memory, shaping how the world understood violence, the East, and evil. A specific human being was dissolved into a symbol. At that point, the fact that he had been a hostage, had been betrayed, had lived inside, impossible choices, no longer mattered. Symbols do not need pasts. They only need a function. Dracula at this stage was no longer history. He was a product, a perfect product for the early age of print. Gruesome enough to shock. Simple enough to grasp. Distant enough to avoid guilt. The reader could fold the sheet shutter and continue with the no responsibility questions. And while pamphlets continued to be printed, continued to be sold, continued to be read by candlelight, Vlad Dracula, the human being, disappeared a little more each day. Not through biological death, but through replacement. What remained was not memory, but a template strong enough to outlive any truth. When history loses control of its own story, it begins to generate myth, and this myth does not need witnesses. It only needs storytellers. Dracula was invented this way, not in one night. Not by one person, but by an entire system that understood one thing clearly: fear, when packaged correctly, lives longer than the people who create it. Centuries after Vlad Dracula vanished from the battlefield, from prison, and from his own story, the world had moved far enough away to forget why he had ever existed. The blood-soaked borderlands of Wallachia became nothing more than names in books. The no-exit choices, the courts willing to sacrifice people for stability, all of it receded into the background. But fear never left. It only changed shape, waiting for a new face to inhabit. Bram Stoker was not a historian. He did not need the full truth. When he encountered the name Dracula in a faint library note, he did not excavate a man. He found a silhouette, already smoothed down by centuries of distortion and slander. A name hollowed out, ready to be filled with whatever anxieties the new age required. And the 19th century had many anxieties. It was the age of gaslight and urban shadows. The age when people believed science had tamed the world, yet still trembled before things they could not name. Fear no longer came from war at the border, but from the slow erosion of order, from the sense that something ancient and hungry still moved beneath the surface of civilization. Stoker did not need to invent fear. He only needed to give it a form that felt safe to confront. The vampire was the perfect monster for that purpose. It lived at night. It feared the light. It followed the rules. It had weaknesses. It could be destroyed through clear rituals, with wooden stakes, with crosses, with the comforting belief that evil always comes in recognizable shapes. The vampire allowed people to believe that horror could be locked in a coffin. that with enough courage, knowledge, and tools, it could be ended, compared to that historical truth, was deeply inconvenient. A man who did not fear daylight, a ruler who acted openly, a prince praised, then betrayed, then discarded, a person who believed order was worth more than compassion, and who was willing to turn fear into a governing tool. There is no ritual to kill that. There is no charm to keep it from returning, because it does not live in darkness. It lives in systems. Stoker's Dracula was a comfort, a story that let the world exhale. When the book closed, the threat had a name, a boundary, and a conclusion. Evil was pushed outside humanity, assigned fangs and coffins. People were freed from the burden of looking at themselves. That is the ease myth provides. But something was lost in the process. The real human disappeared entirely. No more Vlad betrayed, imprisoned, distorted by history. In his place stood a supernatural creature, fascinating, terrifying in an entertaining way. Fear became manageable. It no longer asks uncomfortable questions about power, about choice, about situations where evil does not appear as a deviation, but as a solution. Myth helps us sleep. It whispers that monsters are always unlike us, that they do not wear the robes of authority, do not sign decrees, and do not receive applause as heroes, that as long as we watch the darkness, we are safe. That is the most comforting lie, because it allows us not to look at daylight. The history of Vlad Dracula, once stripped of myth and romance, offers a far more unsettling warning. It tells us that monsters do not need to be invented. They are cultivated. They are produced by environments, by collective fear, by systems of reward and punishment that treat people as means. They do not need fangs to terrify. They only need power and the silent consent of those willing to be protected at any cost. Across centuries, the image of Dracula kept changing. Film literature and popular culture softened him, seduced him, even romanticized him. The vampire became lonely, cursed, capable of love, but denied it. Each reinvention moved him further from his origin, and with each step, the message grew safer. Evil was individualized, tragic, even sympathetic. Meanwhile, the structures that once produced Vlad continued under new names. Perhaps that is why the myth never dies. It is too useful. It lets us talk about evil without touching what is most uncomfortable. It turns violence into an aberration instead of a logical outcome of collective choices. It lets us believe that killing the monster fixes everything. The problem lies in individuals, not in the world that creates them. But if the fog is lifted, what remains is not a vampire. It is a mirror, not reflecting Vlad's face, but our own. A world willing to produce extreme people to solve fears it refuses to confront directly, and then eager to turn them into monsters to escape responsibility. A vampire can be killed. That is what reassures us. We know how that story ends, but a man is different. A man can be legitimized, elected, handed power to applause, as long as he promises order, safety, and control. And that is the story myth never tells. The vampire can be killed. The man can be elected.